Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, one and all. Back to the wizard study. And tonight I would like to discuss, I want to do like another kind of overview of what magical training is and what are some of the things that wizards learn, or are what does the training look like for wizards? If you've never been involved in this, or maybe you are involved in this and you come from a different tradition that maybe didn't do this stuff, or maybe it sounds exactly like what you learned. I want to go over some stuff that you may know, you may not know. I think this is an interesting topic because I didn't necessarily know all of this when I got started. I may have heard tidbits about it, but never really understood exactly what it was or where it fit into anything. So when I first started, I was taught that there were different elemental bodies, and you had to magically train yourself up, and there was initiations by all of the elements. In fact, one of the things that I did to try to become initiated or purified by the elements is I went into a very cold stream, and I took my shirt off and was wearing shorts, and I was just sitting in the stream in nature and just being shocked by this water, trying to become purified by it as like a trial. It was a purification trial by the water. And it didn't have to be that, but that's how I ended up doing it. That's part of how I ended up trying to learn and be purified by the element of water, for instance. So that's one of the things that you'll find is the elements, the 4 or the 5 elements, is a big deal in magical training. And you can think of it logically, like if you want to have magic powers, or you want to have control over natural forces, then you need to understand those natural forces, and people tend to make that argument in science as well. They'll be like, so it was believed in the past that this guy was some magic wizard because he had all this control over nature. Like, how did that happen? Well, it was through science, In magical training, it's very similar, but we do it differently. We talk about it differently. There's an idea that there's like an occult side. There's a hidden side to the natural forces that it relates to us as humans, and relates to aspects of psychology, for instance. Like, if you've ever heard of air being aligned with your thoughts, water being aligned with emotions, your fiery passion. We say those things because that's part of magical belief, or initiatic magical belief, or philosophical belief of the elements. And where do we get these elements? Some would say that it actually started or was discovered by the ancient Greeks. Sometimes they hear it was actually the ancient Egyptians, or even the ancient Babylonians. But typically, the most common you'll hear is actually that it was ancient Greeks that came up with the idea that the elements of nature or the building blocks of nature are the elements, which are earth, air, fire, water, and then the quintessence, which means the fifth essence. It means quint means 5. The fifth essence, which is spirit, which is either the top of the pentagram or it's the center of a cross, because the alchemical belief is that basically all four elements, the root or the center of all four elements is spirit, and they also say that all four elements make up the spirit. So they tend to put the quintessence in the middle of a circle, because you'll find that if you cast a magic circle, you're in the center, and the center is supposed to be spirit, sacred space, what have you. And so you can think of it as a circle with four elements on the quarters and one in the middle, which is spirit. So like a cross with a circle, for instance, can represent the elements, or a pentagram, because a pentagram is a 5-sided star. You'll have the four base elements, and then what crowns them, if you will, is the element of spirit. And if you inverted it, then it's said, at least what we say in Wicca, or what is said in Wicca, is that when the star is upside down, it's flesh over the spirit, or like a goat over the spirit, or on the top, when it's on the top, it's spirit of the flesh, and is a mystical symbol. It's a symbol for the mystical elements, where spirit is on the top, and we attain to that. It's our guiding star, if you will, the pentagram. I don't think I've ever really seen it used upside down, unless they were talking about the divine masculine as the horned god, right? Which, if somebody's listening who has a Christian background or understands those Christian stereotypes, it's not related to that in particular. It's not. One of the common arguments is that it's actually not a Christian religion, so they don't have Christian concepts in their religion, you know. So what we mean is the divine masculine force, or God, because some people would say that it's God, but I digress. So there's four elements, and part of how you train magically is by coming to know the elements, to understand the elements. And they do this by teaching various correspondences, what is called a magical attunement. There's different practices associated with the elements that you can perform, and including meditations, and also rituals where, like, you could actually light a fire, and then you would use what you learned in psychic energy work, for instance, to try to bring in the energy of that element. Or there's also elemental tools, which look like a chalice, a sword, a wand, and a plate, basically like a tablet, or like a physical object, a physical plaque with the image of a pentagram, for instance, to represent one of the four elemental tools, which is placed upon the altar, the magical altar, or the altar of magic, or the altar of art. And all this together is considered the craft of the wise in the Wiccan context. But like an altar with those tools is also used in the whole, like in the Golden Dawn tradition, for instance. In a lot of Western magical societies, they use an altar with these tools, and you may also recognize that these are the four suits of the tarot. And you could also say it's the same as the four suits of playing cards. Which is said, the people argue about what the origins are. Some people say it's ancient Egyptian. Typically, those are people listening to Aleister Crowley. You may have heard it's from medieval Europe, because the first tarot cards we see are actually, I believe it was Italian. from the Italian royalty. And in Spain, you actually see a lot of history with tarot and Kabbalah over there in Spain. But I digress again. So, for elemental tools, like typically you'll get an altar and you'll learn how to cast a circle and you'll learn how to use the elements. And you'll also learn you'll typically learn astrology. You'll learn about the 7 planets and the 12 signs of the zodiac and what those mean. May also have heard about magical laws like the Hermetic principles. And so we could consider all this stuff within the realm of Hermeticism. Hermeticism is a spiritual tradition in the West that comes to us from somebody that we call Hermes Trismegistus, which means Hermes the thrice greatest. And it's said that this was happening in Alexandria, Egypt, around 200 AD-ish. That's when they say that a historical Hermes Trismegistus may have lived, and is kind of like a synthesis of 3 gods, which are Hermes, Mercury, and Thoth or Jehudi, which is the Egyptian god. So Hermes is the Greek god of magic and wisdom, and he was a messenger between them. There was a lot of things actually. And then Mercury, which is the Roman version of Hermes, and then Thoth or Jehudi. They actually called it Jehudi. Thoth is the Greek term for Jehudi, and that's the Egyptian god of magic and wisdom, and he was the scribe of the gods. And it was kind of like a synthesis of Greek religious thought, Egyptian religious thought, so it's a Greco-Egyptian thing, but it was also like a Hebrew thing. There's Hebrew and Jewish, there's Jewish magic, for instance, and Jewish mysticism. And this was in a time where these cultures were meeting, and what comes of it is what we call Hermeticism. And there's a book called the Corpus Hermeticum, which basically means it's the body of Hermetic texts that are basically dialogues that, like the Divine Pymander, that are trying to explain what Hermeticism is. It's like you're as if they were talking to a god or a holy guardian angel or a higher genius. And so Hermes was like talking to this divine being and discussing the secrets of nature. And so this is what we get, and we call it Hermeticism. And there's 3 main pillars of Hermeticism or Hermetic art. And these are magic, astrology, and alchemy. When I first learned that, I was like, what? Because I came from Wicca and like a druidic Wicca, and I was taught things about astrology. Like, I have certain beliefs about astrology that are related to mysticism and religion, and are said to come from the ancient past and stuff. And I was also learning about the elements, which is what I would call alchemy, really. Like the stuff that I was learning about the elements I would consider to be alchemical knowledge. And then I was also practicing magic. I was learning and practicing magic. And then I find out that this is a Hermetic thing too. Like these are the 3 pillars of Hermeticism. You can go read about it. I'll even look it up. Yeah, it's like I feel like we're actually pretty lucky to be in a time where we can just go look up this stuff. I can Google Hermeticism and get Wikipedia, and they'll tell me about the 3 pillars of magic, astrology, and alchemy. So that's another main thing. So we talked a little bit about the elements. Alchemy discusses the elements, but it also discusses the metals and also discusses astrology. And I would say it's also very magical. So alchemy is like trying to discover the secrets of nature through nature's working, through the chemical reactions and such. By studying nature, like the physical chemical reactions of nature, we can understand the metaphysical chemical reactions of nature that exist within us and within the mind and within our psyche. And this can help us to understand nature and thus to understand ourselves. If you've ever heard of one of the most famous things in the Western spiritual tradition, as above, so below, that comes from alchemy. That comes from the Emerald Tablet, or the Emerald Tablet of Hermes, or the Emerald Tablet, or the Smaragdina, Tabula Smaragdina, which basically means Emerald Tablet, and is a text. It's like a short text, like a poem, if you will, that basically says, as above, so below. I want to get into alchemy, so I don't know if I want to read it right now, but that's one of the main spiritual or sacred texts or holy scripture of alchemy is Tabula Smaragdina, also known as the Emerald Tablet. It says, as above, so below, and this is discussing alchemy. So if you've never heard it, you don't know what it means at all, I'll just give you like a quick, like what does that mean? As above, as in the heavens, or as in the macrocosm, so it is in the microcosm. So that could mean what's in the heavens corresponds to what is on the earth, as in plants and animals and chemical reactions, but also within the human psyche. So when I say that our emotions rise and fall like waves in the ocean, our emotions rise and fall like waves in the ocean, I'm making a hermetic or alchemical remark. But I can also tell you that when I first heard that, it was not called alchemy or hermetic. It was called Wicca, or witchcraft. And I was learning about the water body, for instance. That's what it was being called when I learned it. But really it's a philosophical argument. And if you go study astrology, you're going to find the same sort of arguments or belief in the elements. Because the signs of the zodiac, all of them have a classical element. So the way that you would understand that sign in the zodiac is part of the way is by understanding the element that it corresponds to. For instance, I actually have a zodiac in my house, like a painting of it. Taurus is an earth sign, so you're supposed to understand Taurus to be corresponding to the same things that correspond to the element of earth. Taurus is thought to be like a stubborn sign. Cancer aligns to the moon, so you're supposed to have a lunar aspect to it, but the moon also has an association with the element of water, so we're supposed to understand the moon at least parts of how we understand the moon in the same way that we understand the element of water. And the sun is kind of like the obverse. It corresponds with fire, and we're supposed to understand sun and light in a similar way to the way we understand fire. Same thing with Mars. Sagittarius is a fire sign, for example. Stuff like that. So, actually, if you go into the Golden Dawn tradition and do your meditations, there's a meditation at the end of the grade papers for each degree, and they follow a similar pattern where they're talking about the elements and that you should understand the zodiac signs in its correspondence to the element and how the element works, so you can incorporate the mystical lessons of that element into your being. And part of the tradition of astrology is, like, part of what astrologers are gaining out of this mystically is that they're also understanding the elements and the signs and the planets, and learning how that resides within people, because that's part of this belief, is that the elements, the signs, astrology, alchemy, magic is part of us, and we can learn about it. We can learn about nature philosophically, or the occult properties of nature. In alchemy especially, you're going to be working with the planets. Each day, for instance, corresponds to a different planet, and various, like, if you get into the introductory lab work, which is plant alchemy, each plant has a corresponding planet, which means wandering star, by the way, if you didn't know. Planet means wandering star. But all the different plants are said to have planetary alignments, and you're supposed to go through every day, like if you're making potions or elixirs for your alchemical work, you're going to be using astrological timing by figuring out what day it is. Basically, you're supposed to know each day's planet, and then you're supposed to know that at sunrise is, like, the first hour of the day at sunrise is the hour of the day. So Wednesday is Mercury, for instance, and so sunrise on Wednesday, every Wednesday, is the hour of Mercury. And so on Wednesday morning at sunrise, you're supposed to go out and pick up the dew and use it for your potions, and you're supposed to do all your alchemical work in the lab to make your elixirs in the appropriate astrological timing, and to align the planet to this elixir. So you're making planetary elixirs, basically. And this is a way for us to understand the medicine of the planet, because basically you're making a herbal medicine, a concentrated herbal medicine, and you're supposed to be meditating on what that planet means so you can understand it in a mystical way, but also you're supposed to incorporate it into your energy by taking the elixirs and making the elixirs. And if you want to administer it to others, I mean, that's at your discretion. Typically, they would say you shouldn't really give anybody else something that you made until you actually know what you're doing and know that it's safe to give to somebody else. But anyways, part of the whole practice of alchemy is trying to be initiated by the planets. You're trying to learn about the elements, work with the elements, work with nature to try to understand nature and to try to understand yourself, to become an enlightened being, or to achieve spiritual illumination. That's the mystical quest is within the realm of alchemy. And later on, you'll work in mineral alchemy. Some people don't even do plant alchemy. They'll just go straight into mineral work. They'll work with the metals. Like, one notable thing is the lesser and greater fortunes. So Venus corresponds to copper, and Jupiter corresponds to tin, and these are the lesser and greater fortunes. So if you put copper and tin together, you get bronze, and so there's like a Roman pagan thing going on here too. But particularly, we're thinking of working with these metals to understand it astrologically and magically and for mystical purposes, to try to confect the Philosopher's Stone, if you will. Remember, the Rosicrucians were alchemists, which I'd like to lead into another topic that you might be interested in, which is called the liberal arts, which most people don't really associate that with any magic or wizards or anything, but secret societies have known about this and studied this stuff. So the liberal arts is divided into two groups. One is the trivium, one is the quadrivium. And so basically in ancient Greece and Rome, or perhaps just Rome, I'm not sure, probably Greece and Rome, I don't know the whole story, but in ancient times, in the ancient West, there was these things called the liberal arts, and they were called that because once you learned them, they would liberate you. You would be more free. So slaves who had earned their freedom or been given their freedom, or however they got it, would end up going to collegia, to colleges or universities, whatever, academies, to learn these liberal arts, to become freed, to become liberated. Same thing with like the middle class, like merchants and stuff. They would become educated in higher education. They would attain higher education that would liberate them and free them from the strains of being controlled by society or whatever. It's a personal liberation done through these sciences. It was also taught to kids, there's like liberal arts homeschooling, which is like classical education. Sometimes you see like Christian families will do this, and I think they even learn the classical liberal arts as part of their curriculum, and to become a theologian, for example, which I believe is really coming from this ancient Roman tradition. But so the trivium is 3 different sciences or arts, and it's grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And some people actually say specifically in that order, because grammar teaches you the systems for knowing things. What are the actual systems that you're working with? And that's how we get grammar, like the grimoires. They're grammars of magic. So this is classical grammar. It's not our modern grammar, like specifically English structure, for example, that we learn in school here in America or in the West. It's a classical grammar, but they're pretty much related. But the traditional classical grammar has a whole philosophical side to it. And then the second one is logic, which is like how we think, how we discern things. That's pretty much what the trivium is trying to understand, how we attain knowledge and stuff. So logic is like how we actually decide things about the world, for example. I'm not really trying to get into like really deep on the liberal arts, but it's a really fascinating subject. Rhetoric is how you deliver that, how you put it all together. So in language, your rhetoric is how you actually, the words that actually come out of your mouth, how you form your phrases. Do you have a certain tone to it? And then what are the logical arguments that you're making, or ideas about grammar? So like part of your rhetoric would be trying to discern or make a claim about a fact. To call something a fact is declaring the form of or the structure of something. And you'll see this a lot in politics. They do all kinds of logic and rhetoric tricks to persuade you. It's the art of persuasion. But in a classical sense or in a philosophical sense, it's also the rhetoric, when you attain the level of rhetoric or the stage of rhetoric, it's like you're a young adult who maybe has learned a trade and understands his tools, and now he's going out into the world and actually putting that to practice. That's his rhetoric. And the previous stages was him learning actually what all the different tools that they are, and then learning how to use them, which would be the logic stage. So there's like 3 stages to this, and this whole thing we call it the trivium, which is part of the liberal arts. The other part of the liberal arts is the quadrivium, which is arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And the way people typically describe this is arithmetic is numbers, geometry is space, numbers in space, music is numbers in time, and then astronomy is is numbers in space and time. So you can think of it like if you're doing arithmetic, you're doing addition, stuff like that. Geometry, you're looking at different shapes, 3-dimensional shapes, for example, the platonic solids. And then music, if you study music, then you should be familiar with like the monochord, how an octave works, how you can actually do math and figure out things about you can find the pentatonic scale, for instance, and figure out how harmony works by studying music and understanding the numbers or the math that's in music. And then astronomy works in a similar way, where you can understand the movements of the stars, you can understand great passages or great sequences of time through understanding how time and space work. That's how we know the different seasons. That's an astronomical thing. It's numbers in space and time. We can understand the zodiac, and later you might encounter the Mithraic mysteries. I'll probably talk about it too, and this idea of the great year, which are like great cycles of time. If you've ever heard time repeats itself, it starts to get into this, and this is like a science that was discerned by studying numbers in space and time, or by studying astronomy, we can understand great cycles of time. And that's not just a Western thing. You find that in the East as well, with something called the Kali Yuga, or the Yugas, which are great ages of time. In pagan Greece, there was a great man called Pythagoras. You may have heard of the Pythagorean theorem. It's usually the first thing that people say about him. And one of the other things why he's really significant to magic folk is that he had a mystery school, or he was an initiate of the mysteries. And he actually had a big say in kind of like the Greek development of, like, I would say part of the philosophical side of the quadrivium is really because of Pythagoras, but probably not exclusive. Pythagoras he went and studied in Egypt. He got initiated into the mystery schools of Egypt, and I believe I also heard that he also went to Babylon and studied the mysteries of Babylon, which is where we say that our science of astronomy comes from, but also where we get the base 60 system of time. That base 60 meaning that there's 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. That's base 60 system, and it was developed by that. And it said that Pythagoras brought that back to Greece and started his own school and was initiating people into these mysteries. And that's actually really significant because later Greek philosophy was kind of developed. Like Socrates was an initiate, Plato was an initiate, etc. And these are people that influenced Western civilization. These were sages. These were philosophers. They're wizards. If you think of the term philosopher, it's a Greek term meaning a lover of wisdom. So somebody who loves wisdom is called a philosopher. Which wizard comes from the word wise, and they're wise men, or witches are wise women, or wise people. These are wise people. People who understand wisdom or appreciate wisdom, you could say. So they're like philosophers, and wizards study philosophy. It's part of the thing. It's part of the whole. Even if you're a magical wizard, there's philosophy that built our whole ideas of magic. It goes back to ancient Greece and Egypt and Sumeria, the dawn of civilization. It goes back to that, and probably before, because if we look at shamanism, but I'm gonna make another video about that whole story. But yeah, so those are some of the main ways that we develop ourselves magically, or how we understand magic, or how we learn about magic, is through these ideas. And astrology back in the day, so astrology and astronomy were the same thing. They weren't really separate from themselves. Philosophy, religion, science was actually all the same thing. Before chemistry, we had alchemy. Before astronomy, we had astrology. And the spiritual side and the physical, scientific side were not separated from each other. It was a whole cohesive system. And it also was enmeshed with philosophy, which is why we have all these terms for wizards and magical people being related to philosophy or related to wisdom. The Greek understanding of wisdom had a kind of a different meaning than what a contemporary person might think. there was like a divine wisdom. When you get into Kabbalah, for instance, you'll start to see that with like the top 3 spheres in the Tree of Life are Keter, Hokmah, and Binah, and it means the crown, understanding, and wisdom. So there's like a whole sphere called wisdom, and it has some sort of great mystical meaning. And by the way, Hermetic Kabbalah is each sphere corresponds to a planet, with the top being corresponding to one of them is the zodiac, and then the other one is kind of like, it's still the crown. It's like it's just the top. It doesn't really have a planet. It's like the all kind of thing. But yeah, so actually we should probably talk about that. The Kabbalah is like the primary system of attainment in like the Western magical tradition, specifically the Golden Dawn tradition. They use Hermetic Kabbalah to divide their system of training. So it's both the elements and the planets. And the planets correspond to this map, which is the Tree of Life, which is a sacred geometry map, which you can make with a compass, drawing circles and stuff. If you haven't seen a video on how to make it, I think it's worthwhile to take a look if you're trying to study it within the scope of quadrivium. So you should understand the quadrivium and then go look at how sacred geometry works. It's pretty cool stuff, actually. But so the Kabbalah is we use the Tree of Life, and there's Hermetic Kabbalah, and each sphere is the planet, and you go up the Tree of Life from the bottom, which is Malkuth, or the kingdom. You go into the sphere of the moon, into Mercury, Venus, Sun, is it Mars, and then Jupiter, and then Saturn, and then Zodiac, and then you're at the top. And that's called the path of the sword, the path of the serpent, or the path of the lightning bolt. There's different names for it. And this is considered to be like they say it's Jewish. To my understanding, it was kept by the early Jews, mystical Jews, who maybe wrote the Bible, the Tanakh, and was ultimately based on Greek philosophy or Platonism. That's not something that people usually talk about, but there's some evidence that it's not necessarily Jewish, it's more Platonic, and you can find it in the ancient Greek mysteries. And you can hear Plato talking about it, and you can see it in the mythology. Like you'll see Hermes going into Aphrodite, or having Aphrodite influencing Hermes, and that's the same. Like you can, if you look at the Tree of Life, for instance, Mercury and Venus stand right next to each other, and so there's Kabbalistic knowledge in Greek mythology and in the Platonic works, the Plato, right? And in Neoplatonic thought, and in Neoplatonic theurgy. So it could very well be that when Kabbalah as mystical science related to gematria, which is like the relationship between letters and numbers, goes back to ancient Greece and was practiced by the Jews and the Christians and Hermeticists. So that's where you'll find like 3 main schools of Kabbalah. One of them, probably the most popular, and one if you look at Kabbalah at all, you'll probably find Hermetic you'll find the planetary sigil or glyphs labeled on the Tree of Life because it's Hermetic. That's specifically talking about Hermetic Kabbalah, which is, it could have all been made all at the same time, maybe even by the same groups of people, who knows, in probably Alexandria or something. But there's a lot of Kabbalistic history in the 13th, in the Italian Renaissance, and in Spain, with things like the Zohar being written. Was it Spain or was it Italy that was written? I don't remember. But the Zohar and the Sefer Yetzirah. There's Kabbalistic history in like Catholic and Jewish mystics in the 13th century. But anyways, it's a strategy, it's a map for spiritual attainment. So it doesn't necessarily, like, if we're thinking of mystics as kind of, we're all kind of doing the same stuff, then there's no really need to, point fingers. But from an academic's perspective, you might be interested in studying that. But it's a strategy for a magician or a mystic to attain spiritual ascension, and it comes from this idea of divine emanations. So the idea is that the divine descends into matter from the source, and we can follow the path that divinity actually reaches material existence through studying this map that we have. And it's also interesting to note that this is also believed by the Babylonian school. I've also heard that Kabbalah may have actually come from the Babylonians, and like that they kind of came up with it, and they're also the biblical serpent, if you want. But anyways, so the idea is that it comes down from source in a specific way, and that's also the belief of astrology, is that when a soul descends into matter and is incarnated, because there's typically a belief in reincarnation going on here, and in astrology, they pick up essences of the planets, which is why we have we have the planets on the Tree of Life, and you descend into matter like a lightning bolt, going through the different spheres of the Tree of Life, picking up these charges, and ultimately getting into a state of time. You're entering into time, which is inherently corrupted or impermanent, as in you're not permanent, you're corruptible, as in you will die, you will decay, everything in time will eventually decay. And part of how life works is you perpetuate life knowing that it's going to die and decay, and you're perpetuating it to keep life going. So to attain a mystical union, you need to trace yourself back up the Tree of Life to reach union with the source, or with the crown of creation, if you will. And how we do that is, one way is through understanding the planets and working through the spheres, and on a mystical quest, if you will, like being initiated by each sphere. First, you need to understand Malkuth. You need to understand the kingdom, and what is the kingdom. Then you need to understand the lunar consciousness, and then move to understanding communication, for example, with Mercury. I would even consider learning grammar, or learning trivium even, to be kind of within Mercury, right? Understanding love is Venus, or understanding the brotherhood of man, and then and so the Golden Dawn, for instance, is helping you understand and work through the tree of life back up to source, back up to mystical attainment, which is what I believe Kabbalists within the Jewish faith are doing. But they're also using it as a set of tools for gematria, for understanding God and the throne of God and the layout of divinity through understanding the divine emanations on the tree of life, and through understanding the Torah, the Tanakh, through understanding by decoding the Bible, by decoding the various messages, the steganography, if you will, that resides within the Bible, within the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. Particularly, they're often concerned with the Book of Genesis, because the Book of Genesis is supposed to be a very esoteric, Kabbalistic secret, And there's a whole book called the Zohar that goes on and on and on and on and on about it. There's like a bunch of books that make up the Zohar. It's not like one book, it's like a whole series of books. And it's very fascinating. Yeah. One interesting thing I found out as well is I actually heard that the Druids had this belief, or they had said stuff about like when a Druid dies, he travels up a lightning bolt. And we can get into stuff like Thor and Zeus and like those gods, right? In the mythology, we can understand Kabbalistic knowledge through Greek mythology and through pagan gods and through ancient pagan esoteric schools like the Druidic College or the mystery schools of Greece. There's actually, I would even argue that part of the Eleusinian mysteries had to do with something that was pretty Kabbalistic, or that we could understand with our modern understanding and access to Kabbalistic knowledge, which you don't hear a lot of people talk about. They don't really make a comparative study of Kabbalah and like the Eleusinian mysteries or the Greek mystery cults. Probably because typically the general consensus is that we don't know what was in the Eleusinian mysteries, for example. But I feel like we have enough evidence with the mythology and the historical accounts that we can actually start to understand this stuff. Some stuff that I learned from an alchemist, for example, relating to Kabbalah, is something that I had actually read about. Like, for instance, Holy Guardian Angel, or the higher genius, I see parallels of that with the higher genius, or of Socrates, for example, or the Holy Daimon. But I'm not really trying to get into that now. That's like I'd like to talk about that kind of stuff specifically. This was just trying to go over how magical training works. So yeah, I'm gonna call this episode here. Thank you guys for listening. Hope you found it interesting, and I'll try to put some stuff in the description to give you some more places to look and give you some stuff to read. And yeah, have a good day.